So there aren't any new releases out this week that I really felt like reviewing, and I don't have any brilliant listicle ideas. So I wanted to try to explore some thoughts that are important to me personally about our relationship to art and our minds and how to be aware in the world. This one's going to get pretty self-centered and maybe a little bit self-righteous, so if that's not your thing, certainly feel free to skip. I was having a conversation with a friend the other day about the texture of life in the past and how hard it is to remember the way it used to feel to be alive and ourselves, and how there are periods in my life where I don't really even remember now if I was happy or sad or pessimistic or optimistic or what was on my mind a lot of the time. There are significant moments that might stick out in memory, but those often represent maybe a few hours out of months of undistinguished living. And I realized when I do try to think about earlier periods in my life, so often the first memory that comes to mind is being alone, reading or listening to music. I try to remember what it was like being a teenager, and I mostly remember lying in bed alone at night listening to Foxtrot after my parents had gone to sleep. In college, I had a relationship that was mostly stifling and miserable, but when I really try to remember day to day what it was like being in that relationship, I mostly remember listening to music by myself while she was out of town, and when I try to remember the breakup, I remember lying in our bed listening to Damnation by Opeth over and over again, wondering why it was so miserable to end something that I hated and had wanted out of for so long. I try to remember graduate school, and I remember sitting in my office reading The Tempest while everybody else went to the pub. And, I did eventually put it down and join them at the pub, but I don't remember what we said or did, but I do remember reading The Tempest. I went to Mexico on my honeymoon, and I have the loveliest memories of sitting in the courtyard of a hotel in a small Mexican town, drinking Corona, reading The Golem by Gustav Meyrink, starting to have the germ of an idea for what would become my fourth album, while my wife took a nap in the hotel, kind of guiltily hoping that she would continue napping. For any given era of my life, there's always a vivid and detailed memory of sitting alone listening to music or reading a novel, right? And that memory comes with a feeling of wholeness and completeness, unlike other memories from whatever time that might be, which are always doused in insecurity and struggle and fear and moments of triumph and bliss that are understood in retrospect to be temporary. I love being alone, and I'm terrified of being alone too much. My relationship to art as a maker and as an experiencer has always been tied up with the fear of solitude. It's always been locked in a zero-sum relationship with my desire to be around people that I love and the fear that they'll go away if I give too much of myself to art. I've never had a romantic relationship that wasn't at least partly defined by the trade-off between paying attention to my partner and paying attention to my art. Now, many close relationships over the years have been built on common interests in the arts or, common goals towards something, but that doesn't eliminate the sense of tension between those things. The year I spent teaching in South Korea, I was working on my first novel, and I remember being alone in my room, writing, knowing all my friends were out having fun, understanding that I was sacrificing both camaraderie and the opportunity for a unique and transformative and world-expanding experience. But then I also remember being out with my friends, knowing that I should be at home writing, understanding that I was sacrificing what seemed then like it would be the great work of my life, so I could sit with some coworkers and, draw on the walls of a hookah lounge somewhere in Seoul. There are lots of reasons that I gave up writing, but more than anything else, it began to feel like the solitude that it required was a sacrifice toward an uncertain end. With any kind of art, I think that the odds of really any commercial success or any critical acclaim are so enormously stacked against you that particularly if you're making, refusing to make any concessions to what people might like, which is a bad habit that I have, then, trying is basically an act of irrational arrogance. It's not something you'll do unless you either have an unrealistic sense of the odds or an unrealistic sense of your own talent, or unless you enjoy the process itself more than anything else you might be doing with that time and attention and energy. As my confidence eroded, as the sense of the odds became more clear, I realized I didn't enjoy the process enough to choose it over other things, right? Or to keep feeling guilty when I spent time being sociable instead of working. But music up until then had been something that I mostly did around people or with people. So, it seemed like an artistic outlet to focus on more that would be less isolating. Of course, as things evolved, this was around the time that I stopped trying to be in bands and where being a musician more and more just meant, me by myself with my computer and my VSTs and the occasional session player. So the curse of solitude has transferred art forms and continued following me. Now, if that sounds like a retirement announcement, then I'll assure you it's not, right? Or disappoint you by saying it isn't, depending on your preferences. But it's made me think about the difference between mindful solitude and mere distraction. I spend a lot of time immersed in various kinds of Luddite anti-internet discourse, and I keep coming back to the idea that of all the things that are troublesome about the current, entertainment environment, the one that concerns me the most is the way that distraction encourages loneliness, and how it also encourages forms of entertainment that, not to get on my high horse, but aren't as enriching as good art. There was some discussion recently about a survey indicating that young people overwhelmingly prefer user-generated content, right? Which is to say, forms of media just like the one I'm participating in right now, where most of what's consumed is created by people who are essentially the peers of the people consuming it. And there's not necessarily any really clear boundary between creator and consumer. Now, that term, user-generated content, does seem a bit amorphous to me, right? Lots of what's on YouTube is professionally produced film and TV that's kind of been broken up into pieces and put on there piecemeal. And I don't think that the term user-generated content would refer to Spotify, for instance, but, you can pay a very minimal fee and put all the music and podcasts that you can make yourself create on Spotify, right? So it does feel to me, Spotify in some ways does feel to me more like YouTube than like a movie theater or an amphitheater, where you really can't put yourself in the front of it without passing some kind of gatekeeper. Still, the basic idea holds, right? There's an implied hierarchy that I'm used to where a movie clip on YouTube is significant only as a way of steering a person to the full movie. That's not really true anymore. And the evidence suggests, I think, that, in a couple decades, long-form movies, theaters, those things may themselves be headed either for extinction or for a massive reduction in cultural position into something more like the symphony. That's unfortunate because a movie theater is notable partly as a means of communal solitude, right? Of being alone together in art with a group of people, and a way of also, I think, stepping out of the flow of your own thoughts, which is so much of what is appealing to me about the creative act or about immersion in a really good piece of creative work. Now that everyone has a, big screen, high-def television at home, I think the kind of movie that you want to see in a theater seems to me less something with dazzling visual effects and more something that requires sustained focus on plot, details of plot and character to be appreciated. And books are also a way of stepping in and out of the flow of your own thoughts, right? Both of those have the advantage of the time in and the time out. Whereas the sorts of things that come from a phone, they're less like that, right? They're more like something that follows us around, that's woven into our mind stream, where we're never fully in or out. And, the more that we're in, the less we're with the people around us. So rather than having kind of defined periods of immersive solitude like I had when basically up until a few years ago, instead of that, you end up kind of carrying a little bit of partial solitude everywhere that you go. It's both a miracle and a tragedy of our time that the options for entertainment are so infinite. It's essentially possible to never really leave a state of low-level entertainment where you essentially never feel either the true boredom of not having anything remotely interesting or the real transcendence of connecting totally with an artwork. The point here, I suppose, is that I've long been scared of the solitude required of the working artist or the thoughtful listener or reader, and seen it as a sacrifice. But now, lately, for the first time in a long time, I think I've really regarded the habit of trying to immerse myself in books or music or creative work no longer so much as antisocial, right? It feels important to me now in that sense of purposeful isolation, of the enriching solitude of having a distinct and defined period spent living in an artwork as a reader or a viewer. That's much more meaningful than the simple loneliness of being distracted. Thanks very much for listening. I hope all that seemed like it had a little bit of a point. Appreciate everybody, and I'll see you in a week.